All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ, specifically as recorded in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's good to have you with us. Of course, this is a pretty long series, and so it's meant to be taken one at a time. And if this is your first time at it, I might encourage you to go back and see some of our previous videos, but if you want to just jump right into it, that's fine as well. This time we're going to be looking into the childhood of Christ. Last time we looked into the birth of Christ, and now we're going to be looking into the childhood of Christ. We know precious little about the childhood of Christ. There's very little recorded about that time in the Gospels. In fact, outside of him being a baby, really there's only one snippet of that. But we're also going to include him as a baby and what happened. And of course, his actions don't really matter so much as his parents do or those around him, but nevertheless, it's still pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. Where we left off last time was, right at the birth of Christ. We had seen the visit of the shepherds, we had seen the visit of the wise men, probably, by the way, happening at significantly different times. The way the phrasing comes around the visit of the wise men, it appears that this happens much later on than the visit of the shepherds, and probably not the day of the birth at all. And important for our purposes here, though, is when the wise men came, they first visited King Herod, who was not a king as you or I might think of it. He was a more like a governor of that area of Judea. When they come to visit Herod, they tell him they've come to see the king of the Jews. Of course, Herod plots to kill Jesus at this point out of jealousy of being called king of the Jews. And the wise men go visit him, and then, being warned by God, they go another way and do not tell Herod where he is. That's sort of where we've left off. But before we get into Herod's reaction to that, let's go ahead and read what happens in Luke's account. And I thought I had that mark. I apologize. But that's going to be over in Luke chapter 2. And we begin in verse 22. The Bible reads, "And when the time came for their purification according to the law of Moses, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord, as it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or two young pigeons." There was a rule in Jewish culture, and not just culture, in the Jewish law, that the firstborn belonged to God of everything. If you go back to your Old Testament, even if it's a livestock, the firstborn belongs to God. Now, it's possible we get a spam call every day right at noon. Very annoying. Um, what was I saying here? That's the real problem with this, is I lose my train of thought. Right. There was a rule beyond for the firstborn. The firstborn had to be given to God however they could be redeemed, and in certain cases, they had to be redeemed, right? So when you're talking about the livestock, that makes a whole lot of sense, right? So if I...
So we can quickly check the status of your listing. This will only take a few minutes.
It will only take a few minutes. Do you hear this?
891 4823 to opt out.
Oh, brother. What a way to run a railroad, in the words of Daffy Duck. Anyway, sorry about that. It was common for the firstborn of any livestock to be dedicated to God. Now, either that means I'm going to sacrifice that, or depending on how expensive the livestock might be, because the cost of a cow is pretty expensive, you actually had the choice to redeem it for a different kind of livestock, depending on what it was. The same thing is true for the firstborn, and the same concept applies, except God absolutely does not want you to actually sacrifice your firstborn child. In fact, you're going to get in a lot of trouble if you do. But there is a symbolic sacrifice, because just like you redeem that thing that you could sacrifice, you're absolutely supposed to redeem your firstborn child. In fact, this rule becomes pretty important with the concept of Christ at all later down the road. So if you weren't familiar with that concept, keep that in mind because it's pretty important for the story of Jesus. But because Mary and Joseph, they're good Jews, they're going to do exactly what they're supposed to, and they go and they redeem Christ for the price that he is worth. By the way, and this is something that just now occurred to me, I didn't double check it beforehand, but I think this is one of these evidences. Every once in a while, you'll hear somebody make the claim that Jesus wasn't poor because of because his father was a carpenter, I believe. If I'm not mistaken, and I might be, but if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the evidences that Jesus did come from a poor family, because he ends up sacrificing a pair of turtle doves and pigeons. When you look to the old law, you're actually supposed to sacrifice a more valuable piece of livestock than that. I think it is a lamb for the firstborn. But there's a provision that if you can't afford the lamb, then you can do this instead. So it's indication that this is not a rich family by any means. And also just use some common sense. Do you think that he would have been born in a manger if his father was rich? Probably not. All right. So that's what Mary and Joseph go to do. It's tradition. Eighth day, take him to the temple. He's going to get circumcised. He's going to get named, right? We saw that with John the Baptist, right? He was named on the eighth day of life. And we're going to make the appropriate sacrifices for him. Now there was a man in Jerusalem whose name was Simeon. And this man was righteous and devout, waiting for the consolation of Israel. And the Holy Spirit was upon him. And it had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not see death before he had seen the Lord's Christ. And he came into the Spirit, he came in the Spirit, into the temple. And when the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him according to the custom of the law, he took him up in his arms and blessed God and said, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation, that you have prepared in the presence of all peoples a light for revelation to the Gentiles, and for glory to your people Israel. And his father and his mother marveled at what was said about him. And Simeon blessed them and said to Mary his mother, Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed. And a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed. This is an often neglected piece of information coming towards the end of the birth of Jesus, 8 days after the birth of Jesus. There is a priest, apparently well-respected priest, named Simeon, who is in Jerusalem. Apparently God rather likes the guy because he has been God has given him a special promise. You are not going to see death until you see the Christ. By the way, we haven't talked much about the word Christ. The word Christ is Christos in Greek, and it's the same word in Hebrew when we say Messiah. They both mean anointed one. And this is one that's been prophesied ever since the beginning. So people are very much aware of that. When it says that Simeon was looking towards this day, he had been reading the prophets and was looking forward to meeting Christ. And he had been specifically told by God, you're going to get to meet him before you die. And sure enough, he does. It says that he is in the Spirit. In this context, that likely means that he is being influenced. What he's doing, we might consider inspiration, right? So it's not just human action. When he says this, could be coming from God. Likely is coming from God. And he says, Lord, now you are letting your servant depart in peace according to your word. Meaning, okay, now I can die because the promise has been fulfilled to me. I knew I wasn't going to die until now. And it's not a sad occasion of death. I die in peace because now I know that the King is here. And so from the very beginning, Jesus was being understood to be the Christ. It's interesting to note, and I've not been able to confirm this through sources, so maybe take it with a grain of salt, but it's thought that this Simeon is supposed to be the son of Rabbi Hillel. If you remember back to our talk about Judaism, the Talmud, which is what much of modern day Judaism gets some of its practices from, is based upon the discussions of two rabbis, Shammai and then Hillel. Both of these were very prominent rabbis shortly before the time of Christ. And their discussions about the law and then the subsequent discussions that a whole bunch of other rabbis have, mostly about their discussions, is what the Talmud is based upon. So could be an extremely famous teacher of the law here. Who knows? So they see this, and Mary and Joseph marvel at this. And this isn't the only thing that happens at the temple at this time. Verse 36, and there was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. She did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up at that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. So here, this section Luke includes is probably citation of people who from the very beginning understood who this was. Starts with Simeon, who through inspiration recognizes that this is the Christ. And then you have this woman named Anna, who is a prophetess, as a side point. This is one of the few prophetesses you see in the Bible, but they do exist. And she also recognizes the same thing at the same time. So really the reason this is here is probably as citation in showing, listen, even as he was born, people understood who this was. That's probably also why you have the shepherds there in Luke's account. All right. Let's turn over to Matthew's account to see what I think kind of happens next. By the way, one of the rules when we're looking through the Gospels is we kind of have to be able to marry some of these accounts together. They do not say exactly the same thing. They are all 100% true, but they don't say exactly the same thing, by which I mean they tend to focus on different spots. So there's a lot of places where people like to say contradiction over here, contradiction over here. I promise you, there's no contradictions in it. Look through yourself. Read it carefully. And when we get to these alleged contradictions, we'll talk about it, but after a certain point, it's just not reasonable anymore to say, well, there must be a contradiction somewhere, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. So we're going to skip back over to Matthew's account, Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 13. Where Matthew left us was the wise men having to leave by another way because they had been warned by God not to talk to Herod about it. Now, like I said, this is probably long after the visit of the shepherds and the actual birth of Christ. In fact, it could be weeks later, so it's probably after these events in the temple as well. Verse 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the children to destroy him. And he rose up and took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. So they are warned by God. Specifically, Joseph is warned by an angel of God. When we've seen that so far, it's been talking about Gabriel, but we don't know which one. To go to Egypt, because Herod is about to commit a horrible crime here. So they do. He takes his wife, he takes his child, they flee over to Egypt. And this also, by the way, and you'll notice this a lot in Matthew. Matthew loves talking about fulfilled scripture. This is a fulfillment of a prophecy that is made, and it's referencing Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1. Hosea said, Out of Egypt I have called my son. This is what it was prophesying, because he's going to come back from Egypt, but he was in Egypt for a while. Then we continue. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious and sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and all in that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. So once again, you probably have some indication here. They had been there for quite some time. I don't know how long it took Herod to figure this out, but it seems unlikely. That was 2 years. So it's possible that the wise men came even later, maybe even a year or almost two after the birth of Christ. Little unclear. And verse 17, then was fulfilled what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping in loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. All right. What's going on here? with this. Once again, we have fulfillment of prophecy. The obvious thing that goes on is the atrocity that Herod commits of killing all the 2-year-old children and under, male children and under, in order to try to get Jesus on that. Right? That's the obvious atrocity. I don't know if I have much more to say about it except of how what a monster Herod was. There's not much more to say about it than this. But from the prophetic standpoint, this is interesting. You saw in verse 18, this was to fulfill the word from the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they were no more. First of all, that's a quotation of Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 15. But what does this have to do with Rachel? What is the meaning of this? And it seems sort of confusing when it talks about Rachel's children, because when you think of who the children of Rachel were, right, and that's the favored wife of Jacob, but among Jacob's wives and concubines, Rachel actually had the least children. She only had 2, Joseph and Benjamin. Now, Joseph ends up having 2 tribes named after him eventually. That would be Ephraim and Manasseh, but both of them, their territory gets completely wiped out. And so when you get to this time period, basically, and there's exceptions to this, but basically, people are either going to be Levites, Judahites, or Benjamites. Now, Bethlehem is in Judah territory. Judah was one of the sons of Leah, Rachel's sister. And while there were Benjamites who were descendants of Rachel, they weren't around in that particular area. So what is the deal with it saying that Rachel is weeping for her children? Well, when you go over to Genesis chapter 35, verses 16 through 21, you find out about the death of Rachel. In fact, let's look over there real quick. Genesis 15. Or I'm sorry, not 15. 35. I was only 20 chapters off. Genesis 35 verses... Man, I've already forgotten that too. Have I ever mentioned how bad I am with numbers? All right, Genesis 35, 16 through 21. Let's read that real quick. When they journeyed from Bethel, when they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel went into labor, and she had a hard labor, and her labor was at its hardest. The midwife said to her, "Do not fear, for you have another son." And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called it Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So notice right there, it talks about the death of Rachel, who died in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. She wanted to call him Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow, but his father, and I think in this case probably decides to rename him Benjamin. But she dies there and she's buried, and that place was Bethlehem. So the reason it's Rachel weeping for her children is it's because it's at the place which Rachel is buried. It's at Bethlehem. And so we have the completion of the scriptures there as well. All right. Verse 19 of Matthew chapter 2. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, take the child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose and took the child and his mother and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judah in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now, this is where we have a little overlap with Luke's account, and somebody might say, inaccurately, that it's a contradiction in the Bible. When we go back to Luke chapter 2, it says in verse 39, "And when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own town of Nazareth, and the child grew and became strong, filled with wisdom, and the favor of God was upon him." So both of them, both Matthew and Luke, talk about the family returning to Nazareth. And someone says, well, look over here. Matthew says that they went over to Egypt first and then they went over to Nazareth, but Luke says they just went straight to Nazareth. Well, the truth is that's not a contradiction at all. It's just a particular detail that Luke tended to leave out. Listen, there's no such thing as a biography of somebody who has literally every single detail of their life. It would take a whole lifetime to read it, right? These are the details that they felt pertinent. Luke does not mention the flight to Egypt, probably because Luke is not particularly concerned with the fulfillment of the Old Testament. He has a Greek audience who doesn't even know the Old Testament all that well, whereas Matthew is much more concerned with the fulfillment of the Old Testament, and so he focuses on these fulfillments. He focuses on Herod killing the children in Bethlehem because that had been prophesied. He focuses on them going to Egypt because it said, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." He focuses on them going back to Nazareth, and once again, it's not because it's his hometown. Luke is focused on that sense, but Matthew's focused there because once again it was prophesied that he would be called a Nazarene. All of these things fit perfectly fine together. The fact that Luke doesn't mention this does not mean that there's a contradiction there, right? It just means Luke didn't choose to mention it. Nor did any of the others, by the way. Matthew's the only one that mentions that. That's not a problem. They're different accounts of the same person. And speaking of the same thing, now we're going to read something about the childhood of Christ that only Luke mentions. Luke chapter 2 and verse 41. Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of the Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to custom. And when the feast was ended, as they were returning, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. His parents did not know it. But supposing him to be in the group, they went a day's journey, but then they began to search for him among their relatives and acquaintances. And when they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem searching for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. And when his parents saw him, they were astonished. And his mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us so? Behold, your father and I have been searching for you in great distress." And he said to them, "Why were you looking for me? Did you not know that I must be in my father's house?" And they did not understand the saying that he spoke to them. And he went down with them and came to Nazareth, and was submissive to them. And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature, in favor with God and man. Okay, so this is what happens. Jesus, when they're in a custom every year of going down to Jerusalem for the Passover, they're supposed to. That's Old Testament law. There were 3 holidays in which everybody was supposed to come back down to Jerusalem, and Passover was sort of the big one. And they go over, apparently in a rather large traveling group, right, because so many people ought to be coming. And when they are returning, Mary and Joseph both think, well, Jesus must be somewhere in the group. We just haven't seen him in a couple of days. And I always kind of imagine Mary looking like Kevin's mother from Home Alone when eventually they find out that, no, that's not what's going on here. And they return, and it takes them a while, but they eventually find Jesus in the temple. Jesus is spending his time learning from the teachers over there. They're astonished. The teachers are astonished at how well he understands everything. And he's asking very pertinent questions, apparently. And when he's being questioned, he's given pretty good answers. At this time, there's something about him that is clearly more than just your average person. Now, when they ask him, they says, "Didn't you know I had to be among my father's business?" And it says that then he comes home and he submits to them. And he grows in wisdom and in stature. Now, this is a very fascinating incident to me. We know that Jesus was without sin. On a moral standpoint, Jesus was perfect. From all of his godly aspects, Jesus was perfect. He was not perfect in all of his human aspects, because to be human is to be imperfect. What do I mean by that? Well, for example, he wasn't perfect in physical life, was he? Because he did physically die. But in his divine aspects, he was perfect. And one of those aspects, of course, is sinless. Jesus was without sin. But here you have a really weird little thing going on here. And this is one of the big important things for us to understand about Christ. He's not born Jesus as we know him. When Jesus was born, he cried, and he would have needed fed. He would have needed his diaper changed. He would have needed everything just like any other baby does. And this tells us something because he's without sin. It tells us that during this time he wasn't sinning. That's because babies don't sin. Really important for us to remember that. There was no sin found within him. He didn't inherit sin either. Some people say, well, he didn't inherit sin because he had no human father. Well, he had a human mother. And there was no sin in there. And there are things that Jesus did, I believe, and please, I would love to have discussion with this. If you have any comments, please let me know. There are things that Jesus did that I believe if it was done by him as an adult or somebody who really understands what he's doing, it would be sinful. Right? If I started, crying and screaming at the top of my lungs because I was hungry, there's a good chance you could probably call that sinful, right? I mean, it's obviously insane and an overreaction to being hungry, but it's not really a Christian-like way to deal with any sort of problem. But obviously that's okay for a baby. And again, I think, personally, I think here, when we go over to this incident when he's 12 years old, I think you still have somebody who is not fully developed as far as a moral person goes. In other words, I don't think he can be said to have quite reached the age of accountability. Why do I say that? I think if an adult had done what he did here, we would probably be calling it sinful. Right? He has not been deliberately and directly disobedient to his parents because he doesn't really know better. But you and I know better, right? That's one of those subtle things that when you're around that age, you're still trying to figure out, right? Because there's two things going at Jesus. There's what his parents have told him to do, and then there's what he thinks he ought to be doing. And there is certainly some truth to that, right? He should have been learning about it. Throughout Jesus' whole life, he's obsessed with learning the scriptures. I think almost every time, if not every single time, that you see Jesus quoting from the scriptures, I don't think that's the divine side of him. I think that's the human side of him. I think he knew the scriptures that well because he was obsessed with learning them. So you have that push and pull. I know my parents want me to come home, but I know I'm also supposed to be learning over here. I think he picked wrong. And honestly, when you see some of the things that Luke says about it, he says from this point on, he submitted to his parents. To me, that almost implies that this was not submitting to his parents. And then a little bit later, it says he grows in wisdom and in stature. That implies that when he grows in stature, that implies that he got bigger, right? That must mean he was smaller. And if he grew in wisdom, that must mean he was at some point more foolish. If he's not acting in a way for an adult that would be sinful here, he's certainly acting foolishly. But once again, that's okay because he has not reached that age of accountability yet. I have no problem saying that he did the wrong thing here and still saying that he knew no sin. But of course, you're free to disagree with me on that, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. And he says he grows in favor with God and with man. People recognize, man, this is a really good kid. And very shortly after this, I think, some people, when we look at a concept like the age of accountability, right, the time in which a child understands right from wrong, it can be difficult to determine exactly when that is, right? And the Bible doesn't really give us any direct guidance on it. But typically, that's considered from around ages 11 to 13. And once again, there's a lot of wiggle room on that. I think there's a reason the Bible doesn't tell us exactly when it is. And it might even be the case that it's not something that, happens overnight. It's something that kind of is developed into it. But I don't think Jesus can quite be held accountable just yet. Just the same way as a baby who couldn't be held accountable for crying over food. It's all the same idea. Anyway, those are my thoughts concerning Christ's childhood. Next time, we're going to talk about the part of Jesus' life leading up to his ministry. It's going to be a big time skip. I also believe we're finally going to get to see a little bit of what Mark has to say about these things. But we are now going to see when Jesus was 30 years old. And there's going to be a big difference in who the man is. right? Who, in a sense, who Jesus was as a child doesn't really matter all that much. We're not concerned with that. The circumstances of his birth are extremely important, right? And yes, I think the story about his this moment as a 12-year-old is important as well. But I think there's a reason we don't hear much about his childhood. We don't learn from his childhood. We are, in the next section, going to talk about who he was and what we really can learn from him. So I hope you can join me for that. I look forward to studying that with you soon. Until then, love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.